Welcome to Forever Fierce. I'm Catherine Grace O'Connell. And today I'm really excited to interview our guest. I don't know if you guys happened to see my blog post just over a week or so ago. I wrote a post in defense of Facebook. Now, why would I do that? Well, I read a really interesting study online, and that study was done by Dr. Melissa Hunt. Dr. Hunt is the Associate Professor of Clinical Training at the University of Pennsylvania in psychology. And Dr. Hunt is obviously really well known in the field of psychology and our mental well-being. So this study by the University of Pennsylvania, which Dr. Hunt headed, basically was the first study to show a direct causation, not just a correlation, but a causation between time spent on social media and anxiety, depression, and what they call fear of missing out. So we reached out to Dr. Hunt to talk to Dr. Hunt about seeing a different perspective, which was my perspective on social media and how we can use it for actually good and to improve mental well-being and mental health. So welcome, Dr. Hunt. We are delighted to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've already had a full morning, from what I understand, and a full afternoon ahead of you.
Yep.
Always. That is the world of that you live in. So you are the Associate Director of Clinical Training at University of Pennsylvania. So what does that exactly mean?
So I really help run a lot of the day-to-day aspects of our graduate program in clinical psychology. We have a esteemed and long-standing and high-ranking program in which we train new clinical psychologists, people who are getting their PhD in clinical psychology. And I teach a lot of our introductory clinical coursework. I supervise some of the clinical practicum. I do a lot of supervision and training. I teach our ethics and professional standards class. And then I just do a lot of the coordination of the program, helping students find their internships, things like that.
So you are obviously the one who headed this study that was done at UPenn with 143 undergraduates. And that study was to focus in on basically the negative mental health aspects of time spent on social media. And how did you happen to head up this study?
So it's something I've been interested in for quite a while. We've known for a long time that there is a correlation, as you pointed out. You got the science right. I'm impressed. Most people don't. We've known for a long time that there was a correlation or an association between spending lots of time on social media and having decreased well-being, less happiness, less contentment, more depression, more loneliness. But those kinds of correlational studies really don't tell us which way the causal arrow works. So, for example, it's very possible that somebody who is feeling depressed and lonely would turn to social media more in an attempt to find connection and support online. So it could be that being more depressed leads you to use more social media in an attempt to help yourself connect and feel better. And those correlational studies really can't answer that question. Now, interestingly, in defense of social media, as you point out, one of the things we do know from some of the really large epidemiological studies is that the people who use the most social media are the most distressed. But people who use no social media at all are often a little bit more distressed than people who use minimal or very moderate amounts of social media. So it seems like there's sort of like a curve, a linear relationship, so that using too much is clearly bad, but not using any at all, you might not be taking full advantage of life's resources. So to your point. But what we really wanted to do was an experimental study. And my students and I were kind of shocked when we really sat down to review the literature. Experimental studies are the only things that really allow us to establish the direction of causation. And there was only one experimental study that had ever been done in the literature. It only looked at Facebook, which particularly for millennials and the iGen kids doesn't even make sense because they use much less Facebook and much, much more Snapchat and Instagram. Those are much more popular programs for that generation of kids. It only lasted a week, which isn't really enough time to see naturalistic effects unfold. They had people get off Facebook completely, which my students and I really thought was unrealistic. Social media is here to stay. And lots and lots of businesses and student groups and all sorts of things use social media to communicate with their membership. So we really thought that was unrealistic to ask people to get off completely. And that study relied on the participants' self-report about how much social media they were using. So we sat down and we said, all right, we really want to do this better. We really want to do this right. We're going to do an experimental study. We're going to get objective data on how much people are actually using. And iPhones in particular have this wonderful feature where you can get into the battery usage app, and it actually tells you exactly how many minutes every single different function on that phone has been alive on the screen. So it's an objective measure of how much people are actually using. We included all three major platforms that the millennial kids use. Now, we didn't include dating platforms and so on. That's a different study that we're doing.
That's a whole other show.
That's a whole other show. That's right. So we got objective data. We ran the study for 4 whole weeks. The first week was just self-monitoring. So we got all our baseline measures, and then we just told people, just use social media as you normally would for a week, because we knew that just being aware that someone was kind of looking over their shoulder, kind of tracking how much they were using, just even the simple effect of self-monitoring themselves might have an impact. And we wanted to sort of account for that first. And then at that point, we randomly assigned people to either just continue using as they normally do, or to limit themselves to 10 minutes per platform per day. So a total of about 30 minutes, which is still a fair bit of time to spend on social media. One of the great ironies of the study was that a number of our participants begged us to be assigned to the condition in which they had to limit their use.
Oh, interesting. Now, being a psychologist, that's a very interesting fact. What do you attribute to that?
So I think what that tells us is that people know they're using too much, and they know how hard it is to exert that self-control and that self-discipline to get themselves to use less. And they were kind of hungry for something to come in from the outside and help them set some limits on their use. It is kind of funny because, of course, if you want to limit your use of social media, just limit your use of social media. Like, you don't have to be in a study where someone's telling you that you have to do it. So that was kind of funny. And then we tracked the folks over 3 full weeks, and we continued to measure various aspects of well-being over that entire time. And by the end of the study, the results were really, really, really striking, particularly for the people who had been more distressed or depressed at the outset of the study. Being in the condition in which they had to limit their use of social media led to significant improvement in symptoms of depression and in feelings of loneliness. So limiting, not eliminating, but limiting your social media use really made people feel better. And the effect was, in fact, the most pronounced for the folks who had been most distressed at the beginning of the study.
So the things you looked at were anxiety, depression, and then there was something called fear of missing out.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by fear of missing out? That's not necessarily a new term in psychology, but it's a new term really for us to learn. So
fear of missing out, or FOMO, is something that the millennial generation and the iGen talk about a lot. And it's something that I think has always been there for people that, back in the day when you and I were growing up, we might hear that somebody was throwing a party and that maybe we weren't invited, or that, 2 of our friends were going to a movie together, but they didn't think to include us. That kind of fear that you're not included, fear that you're not part of, the scene where other people are connecting and hanging out and making memories. But FOMO has taken on kind of a whole new dimension in the age of social media, because now you can actually see people streaming their experiences in real time. So your 3 really good friends who are all out at a restaurant together are taking photos of their meal, and they're rating the restaurant online, and they're posting it all on Instagram, and you're seeing it and you're not there. So the more time you spend on social media, the more it can kind of exacerbate this sense that you're not included, and that if you're not constantly checking your social media for invites, for posts about things, for heads up about, hey, a group of us are going here or there, that you're going to miss out on that opportunity and you're going to end up being even more excluded. So at one and the same time, it's just making that feeling worse for people.
There's also something called social comparison theory, which is really what you're talking about right there, which is another way of looking at this FOMO. And so young adults, oftentimes, we didn't have social media when I was growing up. I'm assuming when you were growing up. And now, like you said, they have this world, and it's not necessarily a real world. It's a world of highlight reels that they are continually comparing their lives. So share what that means, like social comparison theory, and how that really had to do, with the study, because that's really what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of data that suggests that spending time on social media encourages a lot of exactly what you're talking about. It's called upward social comparison. That because people's social media feeds tend to be very, very carefully curated, they're the highlight reel of sort of, what you've been experiencing. You're looking at somebody else's glossy life and you're thinking, wow, my life just isn't that cool. I didn't take an awesome vacation to the Bahamas. I didn't have a meal. I wasn't part of that really, really fun outing to wherever it was with that group of people. So it's brought something that's existed for a very, very long time, but it's brought it into our day-to-day personal lives. So, 30 years ago, we knew that if you gave young women a bunch of glossy women's fashion magazines and you just sat them down to just page through the magazine for half an hour, we knew self-esteem would go down, body image concerns would go up, people would start to feel bad about themselves because, of course, what they were looking at was this glossy, photoshopped image of perfection. Right? But at least you knew, well, okay, but I kind of know that's not real. Like these aren't even people in my life. These are supermodels. These are celebrities. These are actresses. These are paid fitness models. These aren't the people that I know and hang out with. Well, today, Snapchat has filters that lets your very own friends make themselves look prettier, glossier, thinner, more adorable, bigger eyes, better makeup. And so now, instead of just having that when you look at a movie or a television show or a women's magazine, you're bombarded with these kinds of perfected images of people in your real life all the time. So, of course, that's going to make you feel worse about yourself.
Now, your background is really in CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which really just means our thinking, the way our thoughts affect the way that we feel and our psychological mental well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly that's what we're talking about here on social media. When these youngsters, anyone, any age, looks at this perfected world and instantly compares themselves, we feel worse about ourselves. Our self-esteem starts taking a dive. So how do we learn, I guess, new social media hygiene, learn ways to use social media? It's just a tool. How do we use that tool, not as a weapon, but as something to empower ourselves and uplift our self-esteem?
Mm-hmm. So that is a great question. And I think that we need to be thinking about a couple of different things here. With every new kind of technology, the older generation often goes, oh no, this is sort of going to be, the end of it. I mean, I'm sure when the telephone was first introduced, people thought, oh no. And I certainly remember when I was growing up, it was a really, really big deal when I got my own phone in my bedroom. And I know my parents were a little worried that I was going to spend too much time on that phone connecting to my friends. The difference between those kinds of technologies and this kind of technology is that when you're on the phone with your friend, the telephone company isn't mediating that relationship at all. They're not intervening in what you see or when you see it or what's being said or what it looks like or sounds like. Part of the problem with social media, I think, is that there are teams of hundreds of IT professionals who are incredibly well versed in what makes the use of these programs reinforcing. They're using machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they're doing things like they're partialing out the likes that you get on a photo to maximize the potential reinforcement value and to keep you hooked. So if you post a photo and a couple of your friends like it, those likes don't necessarily appear on your account right away. The program actually holds on to them and then doles them out kind of every once in a while in a sort of a partial reinforcement schedule, so that you're getting it sort of just enough to really keep you hooked. And I think that's part of the danger of some of these technologies. Now, having said that, I think there are absolutely ways to use these technologies that really enhance your well-being and your connectivity. All three of my kids have smartphones. My oldest is 24, my youngest is 15 and is still at home. She has an iPhone. I let her use it. She has it in her room with her when she's doing homework in the evening. And oftentimes, when I sort of tiptoe into the room and kind of peek at what she's doing, I realize that what she's doing is she's studying with a friend. Now, maybe they're using Snapchat to talk back and forth or to send each other images of the math problem that they're working on. Maybe they're using FaceTime to actually have a conversation, but she's actually connecting with a real friend in real time. So that, I think, is a really appropriate use of these technologies and something that can really, really enhance people's ability to connect in the real world with people who they really care about.
You being at UPenn, which is clearly a very important Ivy League, and this is world of social media, still a fairly new world. So what about entering into a new curriculum that really teaches young men and women healthy ways to use technology? Why have we not thought of something like that? I mean, it seems pretty simple to me.
Right. Well, that's a good question. And I think a lot of people have assumed that that's something that parents ought to be doing. And certainly there are lots and lots of articles and blogs and podcasts out there, trying to help parents learn how to manage how to set limits with your kids, as we have to do with everything. When television first came out, when video games were first introduced, these are things that are super fun. They're really reinforcing for kids to be engaged in. It really does have to be up to parents to say, no, you can't play video games until you're done with your homework. And then you can't play them for more than an hour. You get an hour of screen time tonight. You can decide how to use it. Sure, you can watch, you can stream a couple of old episodes of The Office on Netflix, or you can play your video game for an hour, but that's it. And then it gets turned off and you have to go do other things and read your book and go to bed. I think parents really need to be taking responsibility for setting those same kinds of limits with their adolescents. Now, of course, once somebody gets to college, they're on their own.
Parents don't have a whole lot to say.
Right. And that's when that's when you have to hope that people really have some of those good self-discipline skills, some of that self-awareness, some of that ability to self-monitor. That's really what I want young people to take away from this. Social media in and of itself is not evil or bad by any stretch. It is a way to connect effectively and appropriately with other people in your life. But as with any other activity, moderation is key. And self-awareness, mindful use, not getting sucked into, going down the rabbit hole on Instagram for 2 hours, where you sort of look up and you realize you haven't even worked on the paper yet that's due tomorrow, or you're late for a dinner with your friend. Having a little bit more self-awareness. Now, I don't know if there are good technological solutions to this, but I know that that's ultimately the solution.
Well, in your practice, from what I understand, you also incorporate, like you said, mindfulness, meditation, all of those things. So what ways would you share with our young adults to empower themselves to be self-aware? For example, I'm picking up the phone and I know maybe my state of mind isn't great. Maybe something happened and my mood isn't good. And then I get on that phone after half an hour of looking at other photos. I feel my energy drop. I feel myself get in a more negative space. Clearly, if I were self-aware, I would go, okay, I'm going to put the phone down and I'm going to go do something. Like you said, go spend time with, friends or family members, something that, uplifts you. So in your experience as a psychologist and in this UPenn environment, what would you recommend for youngsters to become more self-aware?
So I almost hate to suggest it, but there are some technological solutions to this. There are some new apps that have come out. In Moment and Space are two of them that don't actually physically limit the amount of time you can spend on things. So, there were all those programs that were parental controls that would, say, okay, after half an hour, this app is going to turn off. What all these savvy young college students tell me is that it takes about 30 seconds to figure out how to outwit those. All you got to do is go into your phone and, change the time in the clock or something, and you can get around those. So those don't help. That kind of brute force solution isn't really useful. What does help probably is something that just increases your awareness. Using that battery app, just going into it at the end of every day and saying, all right, where did I spend my time today? How much time did I really spend on this? Mood, keeping kind of a log, keeping a track of your mood, even for just a week. This doesn't have to be a long-term thing, just to bring into awareness. I thought I was feeling better when I spent all that time on Instagram, but it actually turns out it's making me feel worse. Like there might be little moments when I'm using it of, ooh, there's a cool new picture, or ooh, let me see what that person's doing, that give you that little hit of kind of feeling good and satisfaction, but that on the whole, it makes you feel worse at the end. Just being able to bring that into awareness. And then, as with everything else in life, really suggesting to people that they form healthy habits for themselves. Having a regular schedule where, you're going to the gym Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 4 because your last class is done and, it's a good time to fit it in before dinner and your evening activities. Knowing that you're going to have dinner with your best friend every Tuesday night, because that's just a really important way for the two of you to connect, even when you're both really busy. Having those kinds of regular healthy habits, and there's a lot of literature on this. It can take a few months to establish those kinds of healthy habits. But once you've done it, once you've put in that initial effort, it's so much easier to sustain it. And it's really fitting in the healthy, adaptive coping things that are going to make it easier for people to get away from the stuff that really isn't helping them.
And if people are really in tune with their feelings and their emotions, then they're going to be able to sort of track that, like you said, self-monitor. And one thing you brought up was those hits, which is really dopamine. It's hitting, and we have the people who create this technology, their mandate, from what I understand, all the research I have done, it's their mandate to actually have that. Those
That's
kids
exactly
addicted
right.
to those dopamine hits. So it really is, in the end, it's a drug. It's a drug, and it's a drug that we are using for approval, an outside approval, which is the opposite of empowerment. So how can kids use technology to get approval? For example, I have a community. I go to my community. If I feel bad on social media and there's some negativity out there, I will go into my community and I will read comments that are really uplifting and empowering, or I will go lift somebody else that I know isn't feeling so well. So how would you share with young people, really anybody of any age, I suppose, to use social media so that it can help themselves and they aren't looking for that approval through that dopamine hit, but in a different way?
So that's a great question. And I think what I really want to do there is talk about intimacy in relationships, because in a way, that's kind of what you're getting at, right? Is how do we foster genuinely healthy, authentic relationships that make us feel good about ourselves in the world in relationship to other people? And I think this is one of the places where social media can be very problematic, but where people can choose to use it in a more appropriate way. So let's think for a minute about how intimacy develops in a real world relationship, not a social media relationship. Genuine intimacy requires a kind of healthy balance of sharing the really good things that have happened in your life, the things that you're happy about, the things that you're proud of, the things that were fun, but then also sharing the down parts of life, the places where you are anxious or embarrassed about something, or something that you feel really vulnerable about. In a really authentic relationship, one-on-one with another person, you're each taking turns sharing the good stuff and the bad stuff. And when you share the bad stuff in that context, what you hope is going to happen is that the other person is going to respond by being really empathetic and supportive, and they're going to let you know that they think you're okay no matter what bad stuff is happening, and they can kind of take your side and they've got your back and they support you, and maybe they give you advice and they sort of help you think through how to solve something, but mostly they're just there to be with you and say, hey, I like you and you're okay. And then that person will often reveal something in turn about themselves, sometime in their life when they were vulnerable or something that they felt bad about. And then it's your turn to be the supportive one and to feel kind of honored and blessed that this person trusts you enough to share that information with you. So that's how real intimacy develops in relationships. Now let's turn back to social media, and you can begin to see where the problems arise. Unfortunately, in social media, because it's the highlights reel, right? We're really mostly only sharing the good stuff. Now, there are a few platforms like Reddit and others where people do tend to share a lot of the really bad stuff that happens, but then it's sort of only the bad stuff oftentimes. So the problem is that you lose that balance.
The balance. Yeah. Well, I think you're bringing up something that's really important, and why the work of Brene Brown and social science has shown how important vulnerability and really opening up about things that we feel shameful about and we're carrying on the inside that really destroy our sense of self-esteem and self-worth. That when we open up, we actually do create authentic connection, like you said, intimate connection, and others then are feeling far more open and free to share.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And I haven't yet figured out how people can use social media to connect in that kind of positive, authentic, balanced way, because usually those kinds of interactions tend to happen one-on-one or in a very, very small group. And if you're posting something on your Facebook page for all your friends, which I put in quotes to see, I'm not sure that you're really going to get reinforced that way.
Well, I have an idea for you. So I'll be able to share how I think you can use social media in a really positive way by creating authentic connection community and being able to create a safe space where people feel free to open up.
I can't wait to hear about it.
So in the community that I run on Facebook, it's called the Forever Fierce Revolution group. And it actually came from me. I almost lost my life 4 years ago to Lyme disease. And I was completely isolated, alone. And as you as a psychologist understand, isolation and actually the cause of depression. So we find so many people isolated and alone. And one thing I found was creating this community I created what I needed. I needed connection. I needed community. I needed sisterhood. I needed a place that I could be seen for me and also see others for themselves. So we've found woman after woman being able to open up and share how this community has changed their lives and allowed them to really find themselves, be surrounded by other people. Now, we're very mindful about that it's a safe space and no mean girls, and that, the one rule is that we are heart-centered and we are there to uplift, one another. So what would it be like to, share at the University of Pennsylvania or, in your practice, healthy ways for youngsters to create their own, communities that allow people to open up, like you said, be vulnerable, not just share the highlight reels, maybe share the highlight reels and the low light reels and everything in between.
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think it's phenomenal what you've done with your group, and that you have created a kind of safe space for people where the norms that guide the group are about compassion and support. I don't think everything online works that way. I think a lot of things happen where anonymity comes into play and sort of frees people up to be kind of cruel and mean and to say things that they would really never in a million years say to someone face to face or if their name was connected to it. I think things can escalate incredibly quickly online. And I think it has the danger of escalating in a way that's sort of lightning fast. So certain kinds of things that, used to affect a high school where one person would, say something mean about somebody else, but, only 3 or 4 other people knew about it. Now, within literally seconds, almost the entire school community can know about something.
The public shaming.
Right. So I think that, part of the problem with social media has to do with the way that things can escalate and how the distance of typing on a screen, and in particular anonymity, can give people a kind of cloak for cruelty that does not serve anyone well. So one of the things that I really suggest is that we don't have anonymous places, that people have to own what they're saying. So that if you're saying something which is really out of line, other people in the community will know it's you and can come back and say, hey, that's not consistent with the norms of our community. So I think that's part of the issue. That's one piece of it. Another piece of it is for, again, that kind of self-awareness. If you were in the cafeteria or in the dining hall in your college, and you were sitting with a group of people who were really sort of being mean and nasty and a little bit bullying, hopefully you'd know enough to get up and walk away from that and not take part in that. Unfortunately, people don't always have that good sense online. That if something happens online that feels undermining or cruel or mean, people don't always just get up and walk away. Sometimes they engage with it further. And it can really be pretty problematic.
Well, cyberbullying obviously is what you're referring to, and cyberbullying is really bullies hiding behind technology, and that leads into really a whole nother conversation again about education and awareness of what goes on online and how individuals can protect themselves as well as empower themselves, both psychologically, energetically, emotionally, on every level. I think that's really important. So really what we're talking about is education and awareness.
Yep.
To self-empower. And back to the work of Brene Brown, who is a big hero to me. Vulnerability. You are every day around young college students, and being vulnerable is really seen as a weakness when you're younger. Would you say that's true?
I do think that's true. They actually have a term for it here at Penn. The students call it Penn face, like your face. That you're supposed to have this kind of like perfect, nothing stresses me out. I am on top of my game. I've got everything under control, and I'm not supposed to show any vulnerability or any stress or give any indication that I'm not 100% happy and productive and successful at all times.
So if they call it pen face, they're well aware that it's a facade.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And that it's not authentic. And that in fact, once you sort of scratch the surface, almost everybody's got all kinds of stories about how stressed out they feel and things that they don't feel good about and things that they're uncertain about. So yeah, there's no question that people have that. And I do think that to some extent, social media can contribute to that. I also think that there are ways. There's a project at Penn, actually, in which both a lot of different undergraduates and some faculty members have made little short videos about precisely times that they struggled. There's a wonderful one actually by a faculty member in the biology department who has served a very prominent role on campus as a dean, who talks about how he actually failed one of his biology classes when he was in college. And it's such a wonderful sort of example of somebody being able to say in a very public way, hey, you don't always have to be perfect. It's really okay. You can have bad experiences and you can learn from them and you can grow and you can still go on to thrive and be very successful. But don't be shy about seeking out help. Don't be.
Sounds like an interesting future study for Penn, with this Penn face, and really what the experience of being vulnerable actually would be like in impacting someone's self-esteem in a positive way when you might think it's a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. So tell me, when you did the study, and were you surprised by the results? What were you expecting to see, and what surprised you the most?
So we weren't particularly surprised by the results. I mean, we were kind of, we did the study with the expectation that, our hypothesis was we were going to find that limiting social media was going to improve well-being. I was a little surprised by two things. Number one, I have to admit, I was kind of shocked by how much social media people were actually using. That was really surprising to me. On average, students during that baseline monitoring period were using a little over an hour a day. But there were quite a few people who were using a lot more than that, some of them up to 2.5 hours a day. And again, this was only Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. It didn't include any of the dating apps. It didn't include, Twitter or YouTube or any of the other kinds of activities people might do online. So I was shocked at how much time was being spent on this. I'm like, I don't know how they had time to do anything else, given how much time.
Did you find any correlation between if they had, say, 2.5 hours, because I know the study limited it to 30 minutes, which was 10 minutes at the most per app. So if you spent 2.5 hours and went down to 30 minutes, there's a big difference between 2.5 hours and 1 hour down to 30 minutes. Did you see any kind of correlation there, or did you even look at that?
So interesting. Yeah, we did look at that actually. And interestingly, that did not matter much.
Interesting.
Now, the other thing that was interesting about the study, though, was that in that first week of baseline self-monitoring, we did not find that that how depressed or distressed people were at the very beginning of the study predicted how much social media they actually used over the following week. But remember that we got an actual objective measure of how much people were using. When we asked people how much they thought they had used social media, that was correlated with depression. So it turns out people are really, really, really bad at estimating how much time they're using. So how much time people thought they used and how much they actually used was positively correlated, but not very well. It was only, the correlation was about 0.24, which is a pretty modest, really even a small correlation. So people were really bad at guessing how much time they had spent. So what we discovered was that people who were more depressed thought they had used a lot more social media, but that their actual social media use was not correlated with their depression during that initial week. Then once we moved into the experimental phase, we were definitely able to show that getting people to reduce their use did indeed reduce their depression and loneliness. So these are very kind of nuanced findings when you really dig into it. And that was another thing that surprised me about the study, was how bad people were at estimating how much they were actually using. I mean, I think it gets right back to that issue of mindfulness and self-awareness, right? That people were they just had no idea. It's just lost time. Like they don't even realize.
That would be an interesting thing to study too, is how mindful people are, having some sort of baseline and then, kind of redoing that study. It might be a very, very different outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing we see in this day and age with all the school shootings and things going on out there, that young people do tend to use social media also in a very positive way, to use their voices to connect other people around their message and their mission and gather people. What's your feeling about that?
Well, like I said, my experience with that is not in my research. It's more as a parent and watching my own 3 kids using these things. I'll tell you what one of my father's favorite stories is. My dad, who's in his 80s, was spending a week with us one time during a particularly hectic time in our lives, and my mom was out of town, so it made sense. Um, and he came down one night. This was when my oldest son was in high school. He came down one night to get a drink of water, and it was almost midnight, and my son was in the kitchen on his computer chatting with friends and sort of going back and forth on stuff. And my dad was all ready to sort of chastise him and say, "What the heck are you doing? You need to go to bed." And he realized that what my son was doing was helping his friends with their physics homework.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. Now, it's worth pointing out that my son is now in his second year of a PhD program in applied physics at Harvard. So clearly that was his strength. And it made a lot of sense that that's what he was doing. Now, my father said he was bursting with pride, and he turned around, he walked out of the kitchen, he went back to bed, and he left my son alone to do this. So I think there are absolutely ways that these kinds of technologies can be used to facilitate communication and connection, and to establish an ability to spend time with people who have like interests, to find people who have like interests. I mean, I think that's one of the great blessings of the internet, is that if you have a really specific interest or even a really specific problem, the internet can help you find other people to connect with who get that experience and who may share those interests or have knowledge about, how to cope with something in a way that would have been much, 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 much more difficult 20 years ago, or even impossible to sort of find those people. So I don't disagree that I think these platforms can be used very positively.
Well, I think that would be an interesting study to really show a different environment, people who are using it in a positive way versus, like you said, the traditional way. Because there's no roadmap. Social media came up and all of a sudden everybody's on it, and there's no real, it's like, you give somebody a hammer, they can really hurt themselves, but you teach them how to, nail something in the wall, they're going to be able to build something beautiful out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
that there's another piece of this that we really have to discuss, which is the fact that social media is also monetized.
yes.
Somebody's making a lot of money from it. Mark Zuckerberg has said over and over and over again that Facebook is always free. It will always be free.
Not really.
Then how is the company valued in the billions of dollars? Somehow, somebody's making a lot of money from this, and a lot of money is changing hands. When you look at Instagram was founded by 13 people, all friends, about half women, who really wanted to create a photo file sharing program that would allow people to send mom pictures of her grandkids, and it would allow people to share the photos of their vacation with their friend group. In the way that we used to actually bring in the old envelope full of our Kodak developed pictures to the office, and we'd sort of show them around to people. They wanted to create an online platform that would allow easy sharing of photos with friends and loved ones and family. What a great idea. Yeah, it turns out that's not a great way to make money. And of course, what ended up happening was that Instagram got bought out, it got monetized, and it's now basically mostly kind of a platform for celebrities and other people. And it's been monetized to an extent that it's really not the same platform anymore. And I read a really interesting interview with one of the original 13 founders who said that she has deleted Instagram from her phone, that she will not use it anymore, and that she's walking away from the whole thing because she's so saddened by precisely this issue. She said when they first created it, it was a way to allow authentic connection and intimacy across distances, and that she wanted people to come out of an interaction with Instagram feeling really good. And she recognizes that now people walk away from Instagram feeling really bad, and she hates it.
Yeah. I would have to agree. I started on Instagram. I'd never even heard of Instagram, and I found it initially empowering and then very disempowering. I spend most of my time actually in Facebook, but in the community, because it's a bubble that I've created. So I think that's something, that's really interesting. Be it Instagram, be it Facebook, is finding that way to use that tool. Again, it's a tool, and yes, the original intention of anything, changes when money comes into it. Like you said, the algorithms and forcing your feed and those likes and all these things that go into manipulating, that's really important. And again, to be aware. So find that, what I'm hearing from you is find that social media platform, whatever it is that you want to use, but use it consciously,
That's
use
right.
it mindfully. And if it's making you feel worse about yourself, either find a different way to use it, limit your time on it, or get off it altogether. If the founder of Instagram got off, I suppose, that's always an option. Maybe not your best option. Social media is there. It's most likely going to be used. Most people are probably not going to delete it. So I think a mindful, conscious awareness is probably more important.
And honestly, using the same standards for the people that you connect with online that you use for people that you connect with in real life. Most of us don't continue hanging out with people who make us feel bad about ourselves. I mean, hopefully we don't. And yet people will spend a lot of time online reading things that make them feel bad about themselves. So as part of that mindfulness, it's really also about finding a way to use the same standards for how you're going to choose to interact with people and who you're going to choose to interact with. So here's one more fascinating fact for you. On the most sort of standard IQ test that we use, there's a subtest of the IQ test in which we ask people to do analogy reasoning, to compare one word to another and think about how those words might be similar. So how are a bed and a chair the same? And obviously they're both pieces of furniture, right? One of the items towards the end of that test, I'm going to go ahead and just reveal the item because there's no way to explain it otherwise. The item is, how are an enemy and a friend alike? And there's something really fascinating that's happened over the last 10 years that I've been watching, which is that people under the age of 30 no longer get full points on that item. Older people do, younger people don't. And it's because what everyone says in response to that item, usually, if they're going to get it right, is they say, oh, well, those are both categories of relationships. Those are both ways that we have of relating to people. But that's not the full point response. The full point response is supposed to be, those are both categories of relationships with people whom we feel strongly about.
Oh, interesting.
Those are both intense or important relationships in some way. So why do people under the age of 30 no longer get that? And it's because the definition of the word friend has changed. Friend no longer implies a strong, meaningful, or important relationship to people.
Our friend on social media is pretty much anyone. It can be just an acquaintance. It could be somebody that...
It could be someone you've never met. That's right. It could be someone with whom you have no actual personal relationship. Those are your friends. Right. Now, when you push the young people, as I sometimes do once I've realized, okay, I've given them every chance at it, they're not going to get the full credit. I'll tell them the full point response, and they'll go, oh, well, yeah, if you'd said enemy and lover, I would have gotten that. But enemy and friend, that doesn't really work for me. Or sometimes people will say, oh, well, yeah, my real friends, that's true, but not my Facebook friends.
Well, I love that you brought up the difference between a younger and older generation, because back to that social comparison theory, from what I read, you're going to know a lot more about the psychology. Supposedly psychologists looked at that. And as you get older, actually, our social comparison as we get older changes. We begin comparing ourselves to our younger self versus ourselves to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's the wisdom of getting older. And right now in this social comparison world, like you just said, we are comparing ourselves to something that isn't real.
That's right. Yep,
Very dangerous.
Right. So, what I would hope, again, for young people is that they would be able to make that distinction between Facebook friends and real friends. And that maybe even to take that one step further, that they would use the same criteria for who they're going to hang out with on Facebook, who they're going to try to keep those Snapchat streaks with, that you're only doing that with the people who you actually want to connect with in the real world. And so have those standards of compassion and empathy, have those standards of basic human decency and really creating safe spaces and not being cruel with each other and taking ownership of our own actions and the things that we say, not posting things anonymously. Have those same standards in our online social lives that we would have in our real social lives. And it sounds like that's exactly what you've been able to create in a very large community, but you've been able to sort of set those norms and set that kind of common culture of creating a safe space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. Thank you for being here, and let people know where they can find you. We are going to be doing a second show. You have a whole nother area of practice that you really like to focus in on, which is IBS, and we'll get into that next. But where to find you, where to find your work, how to work with you personally, how to find your study at UPenn.
Well, thanks so much. So I do have a website, melissahunt.net. It's pretty easy to find. It kind of lays out a lot of information about cognitive behavioral therapy, about my work in the GI disorders world, and about some of these other things as well. So that's a good place to get in touch with me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing the study, and thank you for jumping on, a very quick turnaround interview to talk about this and talk about something that's really important, how to teach. I like to call it social media hygiene, I guess, or social media awareness, a new way, a better way to use social media.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and take a look at Melissa's study at the UPenn and let us know what your thoughts are on using social media in a positive way, in a negative way, what your experience has been. And in the meantime, cheers, beauties. Stay fierce.